Thomas, that's... Yeah, please. So, welcome back. We'll start. We are a little behind schedule, but we'll make up during the course of the next two sessions. So, this is a session on energy sustainability, sustainable energy, opportunities and constraints, and the role of G20 countries. And we have a very good panel. I'm not going to read out their CVs. Just to mention briefly that the opportunities in sustainable energy or energy sustainability lie in at least two areas. One is, of course, resource efficiency, and a number of initiatives are happening not only in G20 countries, but across the world on improving energy efficiency. And the second, of course, opportunity is moving to a whole new source of energy that is renewables. So both energy efficiency as well as renewables present the opportunities for sustainability. But the constraints, of course, are within the individual countries, as we've been hearing since yesterday, domestic constraints vis-a-vis what we can do for the global public good. So we'll perhaps, within that context, we'll have this session on energy, and without taking much more of the time away from the panelists, let me invite Thomas Fuse, who's the Senior Researcher and Head of Training Department at GDI Bonn, to make his presentation. Each speaker will speak for about 8 to 10 minutes, and then we'll have an engagement with the audience. Thank you, Thomas.
Okay, thank you. There is a presentation, please. Could we, a presentation that... It's on your computer. Okay, good. Sorry. Okay, thank you. Number 5. Okay, thank you very much. Okay, thank you very much for the invitation, ICRIER, Dr. Rajat, and Ms. Deepika, for this wonderful hospitality. I'm very glad to be here. Let me begin by first a few remarks on the discussions that we've had so far yesterday and today. So I think it's been very rich. We have covered very important ground with regard to the G20 in various aspects here. And one of the many relevant topics that we talked on is what should be the thematic focus and the purpose of the G20. Now, there is a certain debate here going on, a controversy with regard to the issue focus of the G20. And there was talk about the core focus and a more broader concern of the G20 towards global challenges. And with regard to the purpose, should the G20 be foremost a platform, or we say a concert of major powers, focusing on the interests of member states, or should the G20 see itself as a guardian of global well-being? So for me, these dichotomies, they're really false alternatives, because the G20 has to do both with regard to the focus and the issues here. They cannot separate the core agenda of macro stability and the concern for global challenges. This has been brought out so well yesterday, particularly with regard to Amar's contribution on how the G20 should move forward in infrastructure. And the G20, at the same time, of course, needs to respect and represent the legitimate interests of the member states, but also address a common global agenda, which we now have in the 2030 Agenda for Sustainable Development. Here, China did an excellent job to bring the 2030 Agenda into the debates of the G20. Leaders in Hangzhou will adopt a major document, the G20 Action Plan on the 2030 Agenda, and I'm pretty sure that Germany will continue along these lines. So with this, let me now look very briefly at the energy topic. I will say a few words with regard to Germany's energy strategy in the context of an overall national sustainability strategy. just very briefly address the issue of relevant Indo-German cooperation in the energy field, address some critical issues on Germany's energy policies, and then talk about the G20 presidency of Germany, which will come up or begin on December 1st. Here we have the SDG number 7 within the 2030 agenda, the ensure access to affordable, reliable, sustainable, and modern energy for all. We have the follow-up and review process within the United Nations. We just had a high-level political forum where Germany, by the way, was one of the 22 countries come up with a voluntary report on how they want to implement and achieve the 2030. For Germany's national sustainability strategy, the energy sector has a strategic importance. We have a clear commitment to phase out the hard coal by 2018 and to phase out nuclear by 2022. There's an explicit objective to reduce total primary energy use from 20% in 2020 to by 50% to 2050, and increase the share of renewables. In total electricity, it's 14% today and it's supposed to be 60% in 2050. Total energy use and in electricity from 33%, 1/3 by the way, today is already in renewables, up to 80 in 2050. This is the line, I'll skip this, it shows you the development of energy productivity, GDP, and primary energy use, now declining by 50% in 2050. This is the share of renewables with regard to total energy use and electricity, as I mentioned the numbers before. Germany wants to reinforce its international engagement in the energy sector. Now we have the G7 commitment to decarbonize the global economy. Last year, we have the African Renewable Energy Initiative, where Germany wants to increase its commitment. We have in ODA, official development assistance, a strong focus on energy, renewable energies, energy transformation. Germany allocated 3 billion euros in 2014. There's a commitment on access for 100 million people through German Development Corporation. Private energy partnerships, and mind you that here the German Environment Ministry is also very active. They have their own separate international climate initiative. This is, just to give you a rough idea, there's lots of things going on between Germany and India in the energy sector, on the green energy corridor, solar projects, research collaboration. With this, I come to the critical aspects of the German energy policies here. Very hot topic here is a lot of controversies around it, is now the phase out or the termination of lignite coal production within Germany. Big issue. Then the target for renewables is not compatible with the Paris Agreement. Scientists and the CSOs in Germany, they talk about 100% renewables in 2015 for all of energy use in Germany, not just electricity. We are absolutely weak and stumbling on electromobility. It's not moving forward, and Germany is not playing an active role in strengthening the European emissions trading regime, which is very unfortunate and should be the key to energy transformation in all of the European Union. With regard to the G20, I would think the following issues should be of primary importance here. I would think G20 needs to make a statement on similarly to the G7, on the decarbonization of the global economy within the next, let's say, until the middle of this century. There needs to be strong commitment to the transformation of the global energy system towards renewables. I would think that we absolutely need to have statement and policy moves with the introduction of carbon tax and a phase-out termination of the fossil fuel subsidies by 2025. We had a T20 conference in in Berlin in May, and we had a nice controversy there. Also, some Indian voices came out against the phasing out of all fossil fuel subsidies. There are, of course, legitimate interests here in play with regard to the cooking fuel subsidies for the poor. So that's something we need to talk about. And I would think we would need to extend this renewable energy initiative, which is so far focused on Africa, make it available to all developing countries. I come to my final slide here, the T20 process. We are honored that my institute, German Development Institute, and the Kiel Institute for the World Economy, it's a mainstream economics think tanks, we have been mandated by our Chancellery to coordinate the international T20 process here. We'll set up task forces to work on specific issues with very practical, policy-oriented guidelines and recommendations that will be directly transmitted to the Sherpas. We'll have a kick-off conference, international conference, from November 30th to 2nd of December in Berlin. Then we'll have a huge Africa outreach by the T20 in Joburg. Now the date for this has been set. It will be 1st to 3rd of February with the South African Institute for International Affairs. And we have the concluding summit in May, but the specific dates have not been set yet. I invite you all to become part of that T20 process. Letters will go out in a week or so that spells out the specifics and the details of how you all can get involved. And we're particularly interested in looking forward to very strong Indian participation in this T20 process so that we can have joint knowledge creation, formulate universally accepted policy recommendations, and then feed that into the Sherpa process and hope that the leaders will pick it up eventually. Thank you very much for your attention.
Thank you, Thomas, for laying out some of the critical aspects of the G20 agenda on complete decarbonization. I'm sure there'll be some questions that might be raised. As you already mentioned, there were some questions raised in Berlin at your T20 conference. Let me now invite Anita George, Managing Director, South Asia, CDPQ, and spent many, many years at the World Bank before joining CDPQ. Thank you, Anita.
Thank you. Good morning, everybody. And thanks to ICRIER and the other organizers of this conference for inviting me. I'm here today representing the viewpoint of a long-term institutional investor, CDPQ, Caisse des dépôts et placements du Québec, which is the second largest pension fund in Canada, and very keen to invest across emerging markets, or as we refer to, growth markets. And we have, in fact, 250 billion Canadian dollars under management. And our hope is that we should direct at least 10 to 12% of this towards growth markets. And this is something new for us, since CDPQ had mainly been focused on North America, Europe, and the OECD countries. However, we see huge opportunity in the emerging markets, or as we say, growth markets. If we look at the energy sector, which is one that we are very active in, we have financed across North America and Europe more than 7,000 megawatts of wind power, which both onshore and offshore, which makes us among the most active financiers of renewable energy and all forms of energy across the globe. In terms of interest, we see huge demand in terms of energy. In fact, if you look at India, the International Energy Agency has projected that India's energy demand will cross that of China by 2020, and that's not too long down the corner. However, our concern is obviously to focus on the 1.1 billion people who don't have access to energy, as well as another 1.5 who have intermittent access to energy. And when you look at that and the fact that it has to be sustainably met, this large demand, that leaves us to really focus on not just renewable energy, but also energy efficiency. Energy efficiency, there's huge scope, particularly in the growth markets where the demand for energy is growing. So whether we are talking about transmission networks, distribution networks, it becomes very important that the private sector and long-term institutional investors like CDPQ actually also invest in these sectors. In addition, as a long-term investor, when we look at demand, as I mentioned, there's not much of an issue. It's really in terms of geographic as well as the creditworthiness of the off-takers in the different regions, including in India, across the different states. So a key aspect for us is really looking at that creditworthiness. That's sort of the number one. And I think what India is doing in terms of addressing the distribution losses as well as resilience of the transmission network is something that's critically important. The second is in terms of efficiency. There is a lot to be done. And typically, when we look at inefficiencies, I remember from my World Bank days, we think of developed countries being the one that have the most to gain from energy efficiency because of the high per capita energy consumption. But actually, when you look at the numbers, in Africa, in India, the energy efficiency numbers are quite, I would say, can do with a lot of improvement. So that's a key area where I think how to bring in the private sector as well as long-term institutional investors is something that we are still grappling with. The third is in the transmission network, as I mentioned. In a lot of countries, transmission has remained a monopoly of the state. However, our experience across the globe has shown that while the management of the grid can be with the public sector, the build-up of the network as well as the operation and maintenance of these transmission lines can very well be done by the private sector. In fact, some of the most remunerative equity investments that have taken place in the transmission sector is testimony to that fact. The fourth area is really tariffs. Despite having spent many years in the World Bank, I'm a great believer that the customer will pay for what he or she gets. So if you have intermittent electricity, if you have unreliable electricity, there's no one who will be willing to pay. And this is where I see a role for G20 countries to really share their experience and knowledge and schemes in terms of how one can provide a breathing space to discoms, bring in efficiencies either through strategic investors, institutional investors, the discipline of financial markets to really improve the system before you start hiking up the tariffs. The second is that there is, again, a lot of loss, both from theft and physical losses, which are a clear win. And wherever we've seen electricity distribution companies becoming profitable, and I can give you one example where I was involved, the Karachi electricity system, where basically, for several years as long-term investors, the IFC, the private sector arm of the World Bank, the ADB, and others, we had almost given up hope. However, getting in the right team with the right focus, and actually it was a private equity firm, Abraj Capital, who brought in the right team and with a lot of focus on stemming losses, on predictability, was able to actually address the system, and today it stands as one of the better working discoms in Pakistan. And we have many such stories across different countries. In India itself, Delhi is a good example, and you have many other examples like Surat, Ahmedabad, etc., which have done very well in terms of stemming losses. An area where, as an institutional investor, we see possibilities is in technology and innovation. So while we are the slow guys with the big equity tickets, we can see a lot of venture capital and other types of investors who can spearhead and really bring to scale some of the innovations. So distributed solar generation combined with gas, for example, is one area that we are looking into just in terms of understanding the economics, the viability, the scalability, which for an institutional investor like ours is very, very important. Also, the question I think that we should pose for a lot of growth markets and emerging countries is, do we want to go the China way, pollute and then pay a lot to clean up, or have a sustainable approach which can then really help us in the long run save in terms of costs? One of the tenets that CDPQ follows is one of partnership. We believe that as long-term investors in new markets, we cannot be doing this alone. So we have been looking to partner with local developers in whichever country we operate. So in Mexico, for example, we've tied up with the local pension funds, the Afores, to look at how we can invest in long-term sustainable growth in that country. Similarly, in Colombia, we are doing a similar partnership, and I hope very soon in India we can announce in the energy sector and the renewable sector partnerships with local developers, with local firms, to see how we can bring long-term institutional capital into the energy sector. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Anita, for that really good and identifying some of the critical issues. And I might add some of which were raised yesterday, especially with respect to financing, technology transfer, as well as sustainable investments in infrastructure. All of these ideas very critical, not only for India, but all emerging markets, growth markets, as you call them, especially when you have kind of electricity and energy deficit. For India, it's about 30%, I think, and for the other countries in emerging markets, a larger figure. So these are extremely critical issues since investment in infrastructure is going to be very, very long-lived. So thank you for that. I'm sure we'll come back to some of these issues in the discussion. Our final presenter for the session is Ritu Mathur, who's the Director of Green Growth and Resource Efficiency Division in TERI, located in this very premises in the Habitat Center.
Good morning, and thank you again. I would like to extend my thanks to ICRIER and the organizers. Very glad to have this very timely discussion at this point in time. So I'll be today again discussing more from the Indian energy context, but taking up some of the challenges and issues like the previous speaker, which I see being important more in the global arena as well. So starting off with India and its challenges, I think most of us are aware about the need for primarily improving the energy access, and that becoming the center stage for countries like India to increase the energy requirements themselves. So the earlier speaker also talked about this being a challenge and posing the question whether we should go the China way or we should follow some other track. And I personally believe that we do not need to see this as going the China way necessarily. And this is also an opportunity that India should see in being able to make the transition early on. So I think our growth story is therefore something which I see being central to being able to make a transition which is slightly different from that of China. Keeping that as the background and keeping that as a backdrop, we've seen in last year the Paris Agreement, India putting forward its INDC. Now again, the INDC, if we look a little closer in terms of India's commitment, has been put forward as 3 bullets. One, which is looking at trying to reduce its emission intensity to a level of 33 to 35% that of 2005 levels by 2030. A second, which is of getting a 40% share of non-fossil capacity in its electricity generation. And a third of trying to build a 2.5 billion sink via the forestry. Many people have commented, some of the trackers say that this is a moderate commitment. I do not see this as a moderate commitment if we were to again backtrack and look at our need for growth, our need to step up the access, and in trying to make this an inclusive development path. And why I say this is because when you're looking at an emission intensity reduction target, it is basically talking about a numerator which talks about a certain amount of emissions and a denominator which is talking about a certain GDP. Now, when India has set forward its INDC, it's assumed a GDP growth rate of somewhere around 8%. Today, if we sort of look at where we are not anywhere near 8%. What does this mean? It means that in order to really keep towards the trajectory that we are envisaging, you need to ramp up the growth element. And we all understand that as you try to grow more, you need more energy. Every country in the world has done its development largely based on fossil fuels. So the challenge therefore becomes on how do you ramp up this GDP? How do you spur investments and economic growth in the country such that you are able to get a high amount of value add and at the same time do this in a manner that is keeping your emission intensity low? So that point being made, I think that is an extremely important angle which we need to keep at the back of our minds in our economic planning, in our energy planning, in our investment, even in terms of how the structures in the economy sort of pan out. We need to consciously look at trying to increase the value add from sectors which can bring in higher growth to the economy as well. On the other hand, there are also challenges like employment needing to get generated, having adequate skill sets, etc., when we are looking at this element of transition in the energy sector. India has largely been a fossil-based economy, especially our electricity sector has largely been coal-based. And if we are to see a larger and larger share of renewables coming in, we definitely need a whole lot of different skill sets. We need a whole lot of different employment opportunities through the chain or through the value chain, whether it is in terms of manufacture of the solar panels and so on, whether it's to do with the transmission network, which needs to be planned and needs to be different, or even in terms of regular operation and maintenance and balancing of the grid system. So again, I think the government has a very big challenge in terms of making a transition towards having a very different employment opportunity set being made available. So again, probably many of you are aware of the recent hitches we've had on the WTO front, with the government trying to have more and more procurement for its renewable progress coming from the domestically manufactured panels, we got into a fix with the WTO, trying to see this as a protectionist measure. So there are these multiple and very complex challenges wherein there are some perspectives and some elements which are very important from a country-specific point of view, whether it's employment-related, whether it's technology-related, and the overall domain of how do you sort of fit in the global arena with how the rules and regulations are set out and how you can move forward. Coming to, again, the kind of choices which India needs to have in its energy sector, we are seeing globally a very different kind of evolution in terms of the global energy markets. The US is increasingly seeing a lot of availability of oil and gas. Probably globally, we are going to have cheaper and more oil and gas available. What is this going to have in terms of a repercussion on the way the prices in the renewable sector, for example, go ahead? We know that most of the countries need to move forward extremely quickly in terms of ramping up the levels of renewables. We have seen the cost of solar panels, et cetera, go down dramatically. But in the whole play of more shale coming up, more the oil markets sort of changing significantly, where is this headed? And how do we sort of approach this at a global level such that you're able to provide a more equal platform for the newer technologies, for the alternative options like renewables, et cetera. So again, as was mentioned earlier, and I won't repeat it, but energy efficiency, renewables, and basically clean fossil fuels are the three big elements which countries like India really need to ramp up along. So in terms of R&D needs, in terms of investment needs, in terms of training needs, I think there's a whole plethora of things which need to be looked at when you're going ahead with regard to moving ahead on these angles. If you look at, for example, what has been done in India under the PAT scheme, there is a success story in terms of, say, the LED story, wherein by mass procurement of LED bulbs, the government was able to bring down the cost significantly and therefore able to get this absorbed into the Indian market in a big way. Now, this is something which was able to work because of a certain business model being followed, the costs being able to come down dramatically as compared to what exists in, globally or what existed, for example, in the EU countries, and therefore being specific to the Indian context worked. So again, we need to find many such success stories globally, what has worked in countries with similar development contexts, and try to scale up these kind of success stories. It does make a dent, but a very small dent is going to get us nowhere. So we have to collectively, I think, again, engage in trying to have platforms where methods of moving forward with very innovative business models can be shared much more, and progress can therefore be hastened along these lines across all the member countries. Coming to renewables again, I think in terms of technology, there is a big need to move forward. I think India faces tremendous challenges in terms of still seeing a big gap in terms of the cost differentials, but also in terms of the workability, whether it is in terms of being able to balance the grid, whether it is in terms of being able to look at how to ramp up and ramp down and handle the intermittency issues, the costs of storage batteries still being a big deterrent to the uptake of renewables, et cetera. So again, this is something which I think countries like India cannot do all by itself, although the government has very large targets and very very ambitious plans of going ahead, things like the solar mission and all of these are in the right direction, but I think a much, much greater move with much more cooperation across countries is required to step up the technologies, to step up the R&D, and to step up the kind of interactions we can have and learn from success stories. So I think the needs are very many, and also in terms of finance. I mean, this doesn't need to be stated again and again, but I think the amount of money which is required to make these transitions and to go towards the pathways that are envisaged run into trillions of dollars if you even try to do a little bit of mitigation in a country like India from now to 2030. Adaptation costs are also there, and the development needs anyway stay. So altogether, if you look at the magnitude of finance that is required, it is a no-brainer to say that investment needs really need to be stepped up. And again, the collaboration at the global level is therefore extremely important in trying to help along at least the energy efficiency and renewable sides to the extent possible in making this particular transition. So I'll just stop more or less with that, but I think the issues which really need to be addressed at the global level, therefore in terms of cooperation, relate with the need for building enabling environments for greater learning, greater technology transfer, etc., looking at ways by which voluntary financial support can be envisaged, for example, looking at how we manage these standards and regulations while not hurting certain developing countries and their interests, looking at the social and access-related sides as well, and of course in terms of looking at all kinds of innovative mechanisms, whether they are with regard to business models or with regard to financing models and so on. Thank you.
Thank you, Ritu, for focusing on India and what India could do. All three speakers have looked at both the demand and the supply side issues and presented in some sense the problem with collective action, or the problem in getting collective action in this area, critical area of energy sustainability, something that we've been discussing since yesterday, how difficult collective action could be when there is divergence of national and global agendas. But there need not be, as has also been stated, there need not be a divergence in the national and global agenda for energy sustain, not necessarily be a conflict in the two agendas, and that you could have good domestic policy which could contribute to the global public good. Not everybody believes that, but there is a possibility that that could happen. So now we have about 10-15 minutes for engagement with the audience. So may I request you to please be brief, identify yourselves. We'll collect about 3 to 4 questions and then maybe do a second round. Yes, please. Go ahead. Yes? At the back,
Hello.
Yes, please.
Yeah. My name is Subhash from Rayon Energy. My question is to Mr. Thomas. He has stated that hard coal will be out by 2018 and nuclear by 2025. And more impact will be given on the renewable energy. But is the renewable energy will be the only alternative to the power, or you are having something else also in the mind? This is the one thing. And second thing is, I agree with the Ritu that she has presented the Indian perspective vis-a-vis energy in the 2030. Now, India has invested a lot in the coal generation, and they are having super critical thermal power stations, and nearly all the states in India are having the super critical thermal power station. And last week also, our Prime Minister has inaugurated another thermal power station. And if we convert this to the renewable energy, and India in renewable energy, especially in the solar system, it is in the infancy. There are no standards available in India. There is no standardization of the systems in India, and the people are reluctant to go in for the solar system because out of the 365 days, as per the designers, they are considering 300 days for the solar system, 65 days for the variation in the energy levels of the sun.
Thank you.
So with this, I ask Mr. Thomas, what will be the alternatives to the hard coal and nuclear energy? Thank you.
Thank you.